Hello. Welcome back to The Haunting Hour. If you are new here, I welcome you to a channel where the stories are told in a high-definition rain ambience designed to help you sleep. Before we start, I would like to know by the comments down below at which time you are listening to this and which country you are from. Now, let's begin. It started with a sound, just a blip in the static, a flicker on the radar. But sometimes, the smallest anomalies hide the darkest secrets. This is the story of the signal at midnight. Jake was a radio enthusiast. For years, he'd spent his nights tuning into obscure frequencies, hoping to stumble upon forgotten music stations, mysterious numbers broadcasts, or even chatter from far-off places. But one night, he found something different, something he was never meant to hear. Weird. This frequency shouldn't even be active. It's completely off the charts, Jake muttered to himself. At first, it was just a pattern of beeps, slow, deliberate, almost like Morse code. Jake, intrigued, began jotting them down, trying to make sense of the sequence. But as the night went on, the signal changed. The beeps were replaced by something else, faint whispers, layered beneath the static. The words were indistinct, but they carried a strange cadence, as if someone or something was trying to communicate. What the hell is this? Is someone out there? Jake leaned closer to the speaker, his pulse quickening. Jake recorded the signal and ran it through his audio software, slowing it down and isolating the whispers. That's when he heard it, a voice clear as day. Don't listen too long. He rewound the recording, playing it again and again. The words were unmistakable, but their meaning was elusive. Was it a warning, a threat, or perhaps an invitation? Against his better judgment, Jake couldn't stop. Every night, the signal grew stronger. He began to notice patterns, coordinates embedded within the frequency, symbols hidden in the static. Each discovery led to more questions, and Jake's fascination turned into an obsession. He started keeping meticulous notes, filling pages with symbols, diagrams, and fragments of the whispers. He reached out to other radio enthusiasts online, but none of them had heard anything like it. The signal seemed to exist only for him. The coordinates Jake decoded pointed to a remote stretch of forest, miles from the nearest town. He spent hours staring at the map, debating whether to follow them. Deep down, he knew he couldn't resist. Before leaving, Jake prepared as best he could. He packed his radio equipment, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a notebook. But as he looked at his gear, a nagging thought crept into his mind. Was he walking into something he couldn't escape? The journey to the forest was uneventful, but the unease grew stronger with every mile. The trees loomed tall and dense, their shadows stretching like claws across the dirt path. As Jake ventured deeper, the signal's hum grew louder, filling the air with an almost physical presence. Suddenly, the radio went dead. The hum ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. Jake's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light onto the twisted trunks around him. And then, a sound broke the stillness, an unearthly screech that seemed to vibrate through Jake's very bones. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Low, guttural murmurs followed, echoing through the trees. The whispers were no longer faint. They were everywhere, surrounding him. A figure emerged from the darkness, its silhouette unnaturally tall and impossibly thin. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were observing him. "Who's there? What do you want?" Jake shouted, his voice trembling. The response came, not from the figure, but from the air itself, a deep, resonant voice that seemed to vibrate within his skull. "You listened too long." Jake turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. The forest seemed to warp around him, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and distorting until they became an unbearable cacophony. He tripped and fell, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. Scrambling to his feet, Jake realized the figure was closer now, its movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet on tangled strings. Panic surged through him as he sprinted toward the edge of the forest. The whispers seemed to mock him, their tone shifting from menacing to almost playful. Shadows danced in his peripheral vision, flickering just out of reach. When he finally broke through the tree line, the whispers stopped. The air was still, but the silence felt heavier than the noise had been. Jake collapsed onto the asphalt of the empty road, gasping for breath. Jake was found 3 days later by a group of hikers. His radio lay shattered beside him, and his notebook was filled with pages of cryptic symbols and coordinates. He was alive, but barely. His eyes were wide with terror, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He refused to speak of what he had seen or heard, but his condition told a story of its own. Jake's once curious mind had been consumed by something far beyond his understanding. Those who later found his notes claim the signal still exists. Late at night, on the edge of the frequency spectrum, you might hear it. The rhythmic beeps, the whispers, and the warning to never listen too long. Months later, a truck driver passing through the same remote area reported a strange occurrence. His radio, which had been playing static, suddenly picked up a faint signal. Rhythmic beeps filled the cab, followed by the faintest trace of a whisper. He turned the volume up, straining to hear the words. The whisper grew louder, and a voice, low and chilling, spoke directly to him. "It's not over." The driver fled the area, but the memory haunted him. He warned others to stay away, but curiosity is a powerful force. Some can't resist the call of the unknown. Some signals should remain unheard. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But for those who dare to listen, be careful what you find. I've always had a deep connection to the ocean, its vastness, its mysteries, and the feeling that it holds secrets far older and more profound than anything we could ever fully understand. Growing up near the coast, I spent countless hours swimming, exploring tide pools, and learning about marine life. As an adult, I became a marine biologist, driven by a fascination with uncovering the deep ocean's most elusive secrets. That's how I ended up on a remote research platform off the coast of Alaska last year, conducting a study on deep-sea ecosystems. What I didn't know at the time was that the ocean, in all its infinite power, would soon begin calling to me. And its call was something I could never escape. The research platform was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but dark waters and jagged cliffs. It was the perfect place for focused study, far removed from the distractions of daily life. I worked alongside a small team of scientists, and though the isolation was daunting at first, I grew accustomed to the quiet hum of the ocean and the sound of the wind against the platform's metal structure. Days passed in a blur of routine tasks, collecting water samples, monitoring the behavior of sea creatures, adjusting sensors, and recording data. The platform itself was a strange blend of old and new technology. Built in the 1980s, it had been updated several times, but there was still something eerie about it. A forgotten outpost in the middle of the ocean, slowly being reclaimed by the sea. It felt as though it were holding onto remnants of a past long gone. It all started on a quiet night, the kind where the ocean is calm and still, and you can hear the rhythmic sounds of waves crashing against the platform's supports. I was working the late shift in the control room, reviewing data from the sonar system, and analyzing the behavior of a pod of orcas we had been tracking. The sea was clear, and there were no disturbances, at least not on the surface. But something caught my attention. A faint, rhythmic sound coming through the speakers. At first, I thought it was just the usual background noise, maybe the sonar equipment adjusting itself, or the platform's metal frame creaking. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't like anything I had ever heard before. It was a low, almost imperceptible pulse, like a heartbeat, slow and steady, but so deep that it felt as though it was coming from the ocean floor itself. I adjusted the sonar settings, checking to see if there was any unusual marine activity or an anomaly in the data. Nothing. The ocean was calm, and the readings were normal, but that pulse continued, faint but undeniable. It almost felt as though the ocean was breathing, an alien rhythm that didn't belong. The next night, I heard it again, but this time, it was louder. The pulse had grown more distinct, now accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices. They were distorted, as if filtered through static, but there was no mistaking the pattern. Whispers, barely audible, as though someone, or something, was trying to communicate. I immediately contacted my colleagues to see if they were hearing it too, but they brushed it off, assuming it was just interference from the equipment or a glitch. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I could feel it. Whatever it wasn't a malfunction. It was deliberate. The rhythm of the pulse felt almost purposeful, like it was trying to tell me something. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to conduct an experiment. I grabbed a portable radio, tuned it into various frequencies, hoping to catch a signal that could explain the noise. I switched between AM and FM bands, even trying emergency frequencies, but the static remained unchanged. The pulse persisted, and this time, I could swear I heard words. "Help us. Come closer." It was faint, barely above a whisper, but it was unmistakable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just random static, it was clear. It was trying to reach me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing minute. Come closer. What did it mean? Who was calling out to me? I decided to investigate further. The next day, I revisited the sonar data. There was nothing unusual on the surface or near the platform, but I noticed something odd in the readings from deeper in the ocean. At a depth of nearly 3,000 feet, there was a strange disturbance, a fluctuation in the sonar waves that didn't seem natural. It was almost as if someone, was down there, deep beneath the surface, emitting a signal. But why? What was it? That night, as I sat in the control room, the storm came. It appeared suddenly, with winds howling and the sea churning violently. The sky turned a dark, menacing gray, and the waves hit the platform with an intensity I had never witnessed before. Our communications with the mainland were immediately disrupted, and the satellite signal went down. The radio was filled with nothing but static, and for the first time in months, I felt a creeping sense of isolation. The platform groaned under the pressure of the storm, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, through the chaos, I heard it again. The rhythmic pulse, louder than before, accompanied by the distorted whispers. Come closer. The voice seemed to be calling to me. It was clearer now, no longer distorted, and I could feel it in my chest, as though the sound was vibrating through the very core of my being. It felt like the ocean itself was alive, aware, and waiting. I grabbed my jacket and rushed to the observation deck, determined to understand where the sound was coming from. The storm howled around me, but as I stepped outside, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. Despite the wind and rain, There was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the storm had parted just for me. I gazed out across the endless sea. The waves were crashing with a violent intensity, but there was something more, a disturbance. In the distance, I saw a faint light flickering beneath the water's surface, far out in the deep blackness. It wasn't a ship's light. It was too erratic, too unnatural. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life in my hand. It wasn't static anymore. The whispers were clear, louder now, as if they were speaking directly into my ear. Come, to us. I froze. The light beneath the water flickered again, this time brighter, and the pulse, that rhythmic beating, grew stronger. It was as if the ocean itself was sending out a signal, a call to the platform. Without thinking, I dropped the radio and stumbled back inside. My heart was pounding in my chest. I called out to the team, but no one responded. I looked around the platform, but there was no sign of anyone else. It was as though the others had disappeared, leaving me alone with the ocean, the signal, and the terrifying realization that something was down there. Hours passed, and I couldn't bring myself to leave the control room. The pulses and whispers never stopped, but the storm continued to rage outside, obscuring everything beyond the window. The sound, that horrible rhythmic pulse, was still in my head, beating relentlessly. And then, in the dead of night, the power went out. The lights flickered and then died, leaving the platform in total darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, from the depths of the ocean, I heard it again, a scream, a long guttural wail that cut through the storm, echoing across the water. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was a scream of something far older, something that had been lost to time. I never stayed to find out what it was. The next morning, when the storm had passed, I gathered what little I could and made a run for the rescue boat. When they found me, I was a mess, shaking, pale, and unable to explain what had happened. They never found the source of the signal. They claimed it was some sort of malfunction in the sonar or a glitch in the equipment. But I know better. The ocean had been calling. It had been trying to reach out, to speak, and I had heard it. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing. There are things in the deep that are not meant to be found, and sometimes the ocean calls, not for help, but for something far darker, something lost in the abyss for reasons we will never understand. Taking a job as a night security guard at the long-abandoned St. Alden's Asylum seemed straightforward at first, until I stepped into its shadowy halls and realized some places never truly rest. The building, a hulking structure of decayed brick and shattered windows, had once housed the mentally ill. After a string of mysterious deaths, it was shut down in the late 1980s. For years, it stood empty, its halls filled with nothing but dust and rumors. My job was simple: keep an eye on the property overnight, make sure no one trespassed, and report any issues. It seemed easy enough. The first few nights were quiet, uneventful. The asylum's interior exuded an unsettling aura. Peeling paint hung in long, jagged strips like dead skin. Graffiti scrawled angrily across the walls told of past intrusions, and remnants of rusted medical equipment lay scattered as if abandoned in haste. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, and the oppressive silence seemed to amplify every distant creak and drip. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant sound of dripping water. But on my fourth night, I heard something that sent a chill down my spine. It was just past 2 a.m. when it started. A faint sound, like someone humming, drifted through the halls. At first I thought it was my imagination. I was sitting in the security office, watching the monitors, when I noticed movement on one of the screens. The camera showed a long hallway on the second floor, dimly lit by my flashlight during my earlier rounds. But now, the light seemed to flicker unnaturally, and the sound, the humming, was louder. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The air grew colder as I approached the source of the noise. When I reached the hallway, it was empty, but the humming hadn't stopped. It was louder now, coming from one of the patient rooms at the far end. Room 217. The door was ajar, its hinges rusted and stiff. I pushed it open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was just like the others, a small barren space with a rusted bed frame and cracked tiles. But there, on the far wall, was something that hadn't been there during my earlier rounds. A radio. An old, battered radio. The kind you'd expect to see in a 1950s hospital. It was humming, its dials turning on their own. As I stepped closer, the sound shifted, almost like a whisper. "Get out." I froze, my breath hitching as an icy wave of fear washed over me. My legs felt rooted to the spot, and my grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles turned white. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across the room. I spun around, but there was no one there. The radio crackled, its whispering growing more frantic. Without thinking, I reached out and turned it off. The room fell silent. I left the room quickly, my heart pounding. Back in the security office, I tried to convince myself it was just an old piece of equipment malfunctioning. But deep down, I knew better. That radio hadn't been there before, and the voice, it had been real. The next night, things got worse. Around the same time, 2 a.m., the monitors started glitching. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as the screens flickered with static, the grainy images occasionally resolving into shapes that looked almost human. My pulse quickened, and I tried to shake the growing sense of dread, telling myself it was just a technical issue. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that the asylum itself was alive, watching me through the very monitors I relied on for security. Static filled the screens, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw faces, distorted, agonized faces staring back at me. Then the sound returned, not humming this time, but a series of faint, rhythmic knocks. It was coming from the basement. I didn't want to go down there, but it was my job. Armed with my flashlight and a walkie-talkie, I descended the narrow staircase into the asylum's lower levels. The basement was worse than the upper floors. It smelled of mildew and rot, and the walls were lined with old, rusted equipment. The knocking grew louder as I approached a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. The door was marked Records Room. It took all my strength to push it open. Inside, the room was filled with filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed papers. In the center of the room was an old reel-to-reel tape recorder, spinning slowly. The knocking stopped as soon as I stepped inside. I hesitated, then pressed the play button on the recorder. A voice crackled to life, distorted and faint. It sounded like a woman, sobbing and whispering. "They're still here. They won't let me leave." Then the tape screeched, and a new voice spoke. This one was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't be here." The recorder stopped. The silence was overwhelming, and then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned, but the room was empty. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw a figure standing in the doorway. A man in a tattered hospital gown, his face obscured by shadow, and then he was gone. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, locking the door behind me. I sat there, trembling, staring at the monitors. The screens were still glitching, and on one of them, I thought I saw room 217. But the camera wasn't facing the room. It was inside it. For a moment, the screen showed nothing but static. Then, a pair of pale hands reached into view, clawing at the lens before it cut to black. I quit the next morning, leaving the asylum and its horrors behind. But even now, weeks later, I still hear the sounds, the humming, the whispers, the knocking. They follow me, echoing in the quiet moments of the night. I've tried to rationalize it, but nothing makes sense. A few days ago, I decided to search online for more information about St. Albans. What I found chilled me to the bone. Reports of paranormal activity dated back to the 1960s, when patients claimed to hear voices coming from the walls and see figures lurking in the shadows. But what really terrified me was an article about the records room. It said that room was sealed shut after an incident in 1979, when a nurse vanished without a trace. Her last known location? Standing by an old reel-to-reel recorder. I've started noticing strange things happening at home now. My lights flicker, just like they did in the asylum. My radio will randomly turn on, playing nothing but static. Last night, I woke up to the faint sound of humming coming from my living room. When I went to check, there was nothing there, just the faint smell of mildew and the feeling that someone was watching me. I don't know what I encountered in that asylum, but I'll never forget it. And if you ever find yourself near St. Albans, do yourself a favor. Stay far, far away. Some places are abandoned for a reason.